there. I am back again. Gonna move my cup of coffee out of the way here. Chilly, chilly, chilly day here in Tennessee. Probably the coldest I've ever experienced, except I've only been here a couple of years, so that's not saying a whole lot. We are reading Mountains of Spices, and today we are going to, or I am going to read Chapter 7, To the Rescue of Self-Pity. So, here we go. If I can get my glasses on. Here. So there we are. Hi. All right, so Self-Pity, To the Rescue of Self-Pity, Chapter 7. Mrs. Valiant was cheerfully and energetically bustling about her cottage, busy with the morning's work. Through the open kitchen door she could look out into the garden, where the brown hen was teaching her new family of yellow chicks to search for worms and tidbits. The little ducklings were splashing about in the stream, the yellow cat was blinking in the sun, and the bees were humming all over the garden. In the next cottage, Mercy was singing as she went about her work. "A really lovely day," said Mrs. Valiant to herself happily. "Just the sort of day when something especially nice is likely to happen. I do hope poor Dismal's awful almanac is not foretelling calamity. I wonder whether I ought to go see her. I should love to know what happened after the shepherd went into her cottage." Just as she reached that point in her thoughts, the garden gate clicked, and looking out, she saw a tall woman wearing a most beautiful oriental-looking shawl, embroidered all over with richly glowing colors. The pattern outlined in threads of gold and silver, which shone and sparkled in the bright sunshine, making it a thing of almost dazzling beauty. Mrs. Valiant's attention was so taken by the glittering shawl, and she was so astonished that anyone so gorgeously appareled should actually be walking up the garden path towards her kitchen door, and so occupied in wondering whoever it could be, that for a moment or two she did not recognize the face of the newcomer. When she did, she gave a little gasp of bewildered amazement, and then her eyes misted over with tears of joy, so that everything was blurred. "Why, Dismal, my dear!" exclaimed she, when she could successfully get rid of a queer little choke in her voice. "Why, Dismal, is that really you? I was just thinking about you and wondering whether I should go to see you. But this is 100 times better. Sit down here on the porch and let me look at you. It really is you, isn't it, Dismal?" Mrs. Dismal Forebodings came forward a little hesitatingly, then went up to her old friend and did what she had never done since they were girls together at school: put her arms around her and kissed her. "Yes, it is I, myself," said she, with a shy little laugh. "I expect you are wondering whatever I am doing, walking about in a shawl like this, Valiant." "It is simply beautiful," said Mrs. Valiant in a tone of ecstasy. "I never saw anything lovelier, and it suits you perfectly, Dismal. You are so tall and dignified when you are not mooning about in a drab dress and your widow's weeds. I'm thankful to see that you are not wearing them any longer. But tell me, Dismal, where did you get that exquisite shawl?" "The shepherd gave it to me," said Mrs. Dismal simply, "and told me that it was his wish that I wear it always. Otherwise, my dear Valiant, I would naturally have folded such a beautiful garment away in tissue paper as a priceless heirloom, only to be worn on feast days at very special occasions, if then. But he said so firmly that it was his wish that I should wear it every day, unsuitable for a poor widow as it seems, that I do not like to disregard his request. You see, Valiant, he has done so much for me that I cannot refuse to do what he asks. He has taken me into his service, old and dreary as I am, and has spoken so comfortingly to poor Gloomy and myself that we really feel like new people beginning life all over again. He tells me that this beautiful shawl is called the Garment of Praise. And he gave one almost exactly like it to Gloomy and told us that he would give us beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. And of course, when I had this beautiful glittering thing over my shoulders, Valiant dear, it made my dreary old gray dress look too awful for words. That is why, you see, I have discarded my widow's weeds altogether, and am wearing one of the light, pretty dresses which I thought I had laid aside forever. I am still a little self-conscious, I fear, added she with a rather shamefaced laugh, but I shall get used to it presently, I hope, and know how to wear it more naturally and gracefully, to the glory of the one who gave it to me. She paused for a moment as though she could hardly go on speaking, and then she put out her hand and laid it tremblingly on her friend's arm. It was you who brought him to the cottage, Valiant, said she softly, and I don't know how to begin to thank you. All these years you've been so patient with me and so faithful, putting up with all my miserable selfishness and ungraciousness. If it were not for you, Valiant, none of this would have happened. Mrs. Valiant sat there in the sun-filled porch holding Dismal's hand in both of her own, beaming like the sun itself and quite unashamedly allowing the tears of joy to trickle down her cheeks. But speech was never her strong point. She always expressed herself more fluently through bustling, loving activity. When at last she could find her voice, all she said was, Dismal, my dear, this is the happiest day of my life. I'll just slip into the kitchen and put the kettle on the fire. It's nearly boiling, and we'll have a good cup of tea together. You wait here on the porch, and while the kettle is boiling, I'm going across to the other cottage to call Mercy to come and join us. Away she bustled and was over in her daughter's cottage in a moment. There, to her extreme delight, she found that Grace and Glory had just arrived and was talking to Mercy. They broke off immediately, however, and looked in astonishment at Mrs. Valiant, who stood before them, her cheeks still wet with tears, and her face one radiant smile of joy. Oh, Grace and Glory, she exclaimed, how glad I am to find you here too. It is just right. Your Aunt Dismal is over in my cottage, and you must both come and have a cup of tea with us. Aunt Dismal, they both exclaimed together. Oh, tell us what's happened. She's not been outside her cottage for months. Come and see, cried Mrs. Valiant happily. Just see what the shepherd has done for her. You go across now, both of you, and make the tea, Mercy dear. I am just going out into the road to see whether there is anyone else about who can share in our joy. Then out she went, and sure enough, whom should she see but Mrs. Dismal's daughter, Gloomy, hesitating at the gate. Mrs. Valiant, said Gloomy awkwardly. In the days when she was first married to Lord Fearing's son, she had not deigned to know her mother's old friend, Mrs. Valiant, the shepherdess. Mrs. Valiant, have you seen my mother anywhere? I think she was planning to visit you." Mrs. Valiant took her warmly by the arm, as though she were a close friend, as though she had never been snubbed and coldly ignored by the young woman, now standing shamefacedly before her. And she exclaimed heartily, "Yes, indeed. She is now sitting in the porch of my cottage, and we are just going to have a cup of tea. Come and join us, my dear." Gloomy drew back a little with a slight flush on her cheeks. After snubbing and patronizing people all her life, until the tables were turned in such a disastrous fashion, she now felt miserable and ashamed in the presence of all those whom she had so treated. Without appearing to notice, Mrs. Valiant went on cheerfully. "Mercy and your cousin Grace and Glory are there already. Do come, dear Gloomy. It will make us all so happy." "Is Grace and Glory there too?" asked Gloomy in quite another tone of voice. "Thank you, Mrs. Valiant. I shall be glad to come." So over to the cottage they went, and what a scene it was! There in the shady honeysuckle-covered porch was the table spread with a white cloth, and upon it the blue and white cups and saucers, the old brown teapot, and one of Mrs. Valiant's famous cakes, so crisp and delicious smelling that it made one's mouth water. And there was Mrs. Dismal and her daughter Gloomy, wearing their beautiful shawls, and Mrs. Valiant with her face as bright as the morning itself. Mercy sat on one side of Mrs. Dismal, and Grace and Glory sat beside her cousin. Joy and Peace were present too. Other members of the two households joined the party also, for the domestic creatures were there in full force. The white and black cat came walking sedately across from the cottage next door and sat beside the yellow one, both ostentatiously washing their faces in anticipation and keeping a close watch on the table. The brown hen, loudly clucking, hurried there with her brood, all ready to receive the crumbs, and the ducklings left the stream and came waddling up the path. One or two of the neighboring dogs strolled nonchalantly into the garden as though they had just looked in by chance. Everyone at the party was in the best of spirits. To Mrs. Dismal and Gloomy, it was as strange as though they had suddenly been transported into a new world. How they talked, sharing the news with one another and making the two guests go over their story again and again of what had happened when the shepherd went into the cottage. Most of all, they talked with happy faces and happy voices about the shepherd himself. When they were well on towards emptying the big teapot for the third time, they were joined by a neighbor, Mrs. Gossip, who was bursting with news. She said that she had just looked in to tell them that Self-Pity, your cousin, you know, much afraid, had been taken dangerously ill, and his wife, helpless, was at her wits' end, not knowing what to do. The doctor, when he came, had said it was a serious case of double pneumonia, and that the patient must be kept absolutely quiet, with a nurse in attendance day and night. And you all know how utterly unpractical and useless poor Helpless is in an emergency, Mrs. Gossip wound up adding with a dolorous satisfaction. It seemed that Self-Pity himself is so terrified that he is going to die that they can't keep him quiet. I am afraid they must be having a dreadful time, and that youngest child of theirs, little Doldrums, is tumbling about all over the place with no one to look after him, getting in everybody's way and nearly falling into the fire, and likely to burn or scald himself to death. A little terror, if ever there was one. No one can do anything with him. No, thank you, Mrs. Valiant. 1 cup of tea is quite enough. It was most refreshing. I really must be going. Thank you very much indeed." With another curious, scrutinizing stare at Mrs. Dismal and her daughter, whom she had been covertly watching all the time that she poured out her story, Mrs. Gossip departed in great excitement to impart her news at the next cottage, with the added spicy tidbit that Mrs. Dismal and her daughter Gloomy must have come into a mint of money and were all decked out in the most extravagant style. Perhaps Sir Coward had been forced at last to pay financial compensation to his deserted wife, and now she and her mother were walking about like fashion plates. The group on the porch looked at one another, and then Mrs. Dismal groaned and said, "My poor nephew, self-pity, his wife helpless, is the most inefficient housekeeper imaginable, and she knows absolutely nothing about nursing." "Double pneumonia!" exclaimed Mercy commiseratingly, "with no one to nurse him but that helpless little wife of his? And the house all upside down, and that unhappy child with no one to do a thing for him," said Mrs. Valiant. "It's dreadful. And self-pity himself. So terrified," added Grace and Glory. "I know how awful that is, and there is no one there to say a word to help him." "And the district nurse away at the end of the valley," said Gloomy in the tone of one contributing to the pile of agony. "I met her early this morning starting off on her bicycle, and she told me she would not be back until the evening." Mrs. Valiant rose to her feet briskly, with the manner of one already to take charge and organize a rescue party. She was in her element in any emergency. "We must do something for them at once," said she with the utmost cheerfulness. "They need us, that is evident. Now is the opportunity for which we've been waiting so long to get into their cottage." "As I am a trained nurse," said Mercy happily, "I will go along at once and offer to be his nurse as long as they need me. Of course, it may be that the doctor will send him to the hospital in the City of Destruction, but it is so far away that I think it unlikely they will risk moving him at this stage." "And I shall go with you," cried Mrs. Valiant, "and see what I can do to put the cottage in order and make a meal for poor helpless and the children. I shall try to persuade her to let me bring little Doldrums home with me so I can look after him here. "You'll have a time of it, I warn you," said Mrs. Dismal forebodings gloomily. "He is the most undisciplined, obstinate, brawling, destructive little brat that you could possibly have to do with, tearing to pieces whatever he can lay his hands on. You'll never have a moment's peace, Valiant. Mrs. Dismal, you will notice, although she had begun to wear the garment of praise, had only just entered the shepherd's service, and naturally did not yet know the language of the high places. "If you offer to help helpless," said Gloomy in a tone just like her name, "she'll roll the whole responsibility and the work onto you, and you'll find that she won't lift a finger herself, but leave you to carry the whole burden of everything." "Oh, that won't matter," exclaimed Mrs. Valiant and her daughter, Mercy, both together and smiling at one another without the least dismay. "That's all right. We have been wanting to get into that home for a long time, and now at last here is our chance." Then she turned to Grace and Glory and said persuasively, "Do come with us, Grace and Glory. I can put a house to rights and cook a meal, but I'm no good at saying anything. I'm altogether too tactless." As she spoke, she smiled ruefully at Mrs. Dismal, remembering her many bracing but tactless admonitions, and how often they had had the opposite effect to that desired. "But you'll know just how to help poor self-pity, Grace and Glory, and what to say to him." You were one of the Fearings yourself at one time and will understand exactly what he needs." "Of course I'm willing to go with you," said Grace and Glory. "I'm not a nurse or a cook, and I don't know anything about looking after little children, but I can sit beside poor Self-Pity and try to take away his fears. For I do know from dreadful experience all about the horror of fearing death. And perhaps he will listen to me now and be comforted." So off they went, all three of them, and the two lovely handmaidens, Joy and Peace, went with them, each of them looking as radiant as if they were just starting for a visit to the king's palace. So happy were they at the thought of being able, at last, to help the miserable family of Self-Pity. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings and Gloomy watched them as they bustled cheerfully away, and there was a wistful envy on the faces of both mother and daughter. Then Gloomy suddenly cried out, "Oh, Mother, how I do wish that you and I could go to the high places too, and receive new names and be able to help others in the same lovely way." "I wish it too," said Mrs. Dismal Foreboding sadly, "but I am afraid that I am too old, my dear, and have most unhappily put off turning to the shepherd for too long. But Gloomy, I think he might take you if we ask him. You are still young, my love, and could go to the mountains." "I would certainly not go without you, Mother," said Gloomy firmly. "It may be that we are both unworthy of such a wonderful privilege. I am sure I am." "Let us go and see the shepherd," said Mrs. Dismal after a little pause. "I do really believe that it is possible that he would take you there, Gloomy. At least we may perhaps ask him and see what he says. It is just midday now, and he and the flock will be resting somewhere in the pastures, perhaps not too far away. Let's try to find him." So they went together along the path, which Much Afraid had so often followed toward the open pastures. And there, to their thankful joy, they did find the shepherd resting in the shade of some great trees. He welcomed them so graciously that both mother and daughter plucked up heart. First they told him where they had come from, and how Mrs. Valiant, Mercy, and Grace and Glory had all gone off to the home of Self-Pity, who was dangerously ill, to see whether they could do anything to help. "Ah," said the shepherd thoughtfully, "so they have gone to try to help Self-Pity, have they?" "Yes, and they look so happy," said Gloomy timidly, "just as they do when they are starting for the high places with you, shepherd." "Is that so?" said he, smiling slightly. "What do you know about the high places, Gloomy?" "Nothing," she answered sorrowfully, "except that is where you took my cousin, Much Afraid, and gave her hinds feet and changed her name." Then she added passionately, "Oh, if only Mother and I could go there too." "Of course you can go there," answered the shepherd at once. "You have only to ask me to take you." They stared at him with almost incredulous joy. Then Mrs. Dismal Forebodings asked, "Do you really mean it? But we have only just entered your service, shepherd, and Much Afraid worked for you for years before you took her there." "You've waited many more years before entering my service than Much Afraid did," said the shepherd, with his lovely gentle smile. "But you do not have to wait as long as she did before you asked me to take you to the high places. If you really want to go, I will take you at once." They went right up to him, took his hands, and said both together, "Oh, we do want it. We want it more than anything else in the world. Please take us there, that we may receive new names and be changed completely." "There is one condition," said he, just as he had told Much Afraid. "I must plant the seed of love in your hearts, or you will not be allowed to enter the kingdom of love of which the high places are a part. Then he showed them the thorn-shaped seeds, one of which he had planted in the heart of poor Much Afraid when she tremblingly decided to follow him to the mountains. Then Mrs. Dismal Forebodings and Gloomy at once bared their hearts so that he could plant the seeds there too, and with his own scarred hands the shepherd did so. He then told them to go home and make themselves ready for the journey, so that when he came to call them, they would be ready to leave with him at once. He himself walked back with them toward the village, and when they got there, whom should they see coming down the street but Mrs. Valiant, looking dreadfully hot and breathless, and holding little Doldrum's Self-Pity by the hand, literally dragging him along. He was a small but sturdy infant, and at that moment was quite unbelievably ugly. He had both feet planted on the ground and was leaning backwards, pulling with all his strength, so that really the veins were swelling on the baby's face, and he was bawling at the top of his voice, "I won't go! Let me go, you horrid old woman! I won't go with you! I won't! I won't! Mama! Mama!" "Oh, dear! Poor, kind Mrs. Valiant," groaned Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, lapsing at once into her old desponding mood. "I tried to warn her how it would be. It looks as though the child will have a fit or burst a blood vessel. Could anyone imagine that a little creature that size could have such a wicked temper? Oh, dear! I really think he is going to choke himself to death." The shepherd strode forward. "Hello, my little man," he said cheerfully. "Tell me what is happening to make you so unhappy." Little Doldrum stopped bawling for a moment and opened his eyes and looked up. He appeared to hesitate as to whether he would bellow again or not. Then he put his finger in his mouth and stared in silence at the tall figure towering above him, and at the kind face smiling down at him from such a height. "What's your name?" said the cheery voice. "Doldrums," lisped the youngest member of the family of Self-Pity. "What's yours?" "I am the shepherd," said he. "Now then, up you come on my shoulders as though you were one of my sheep being rescued from a lion." "There," said he, as he swung him up so that he sat astride both his shoulders. "Hold tight now, and I'll show you that not even the biggest and fiercest lion could spring as far as I can, or could catch you as long as I am carrying you." And with that he made a great bounding leap and set off down the road toward Mrs. Valiant's cottage, with small Doldrums high up aloft, chortling and beaming and drumming with both feet on the shepherd's chest, and shouting at the top of his voice, "Faster! Faster! The natty old lion's coming! Oh my, what a jump! Do it again, please! Shepherd, do it again!" Mrs. Valiant laughed heartily at the picture, but Mrs. Dismal and Gloomy looked as though they could hardly believe their eyes. They arrived at the gate of the cottage together because the shepherd took a roundabout way, so that by the time they got there and little Doldrums was lowered to the ground, he was as cheerful as a cricket. As soon as they got inside the gate, along came the yellow cat, eager to meet her special friend, arching her back and rubbing against the shepherd's legs and purring loudly, asking as plainly as possible where he had been all this long time. Little Doldrums immediately put out both hands to seize her by the tail, as he did to any unwary animal that chanced to fall into his clutches. "Not that end, Doldrums," said the shepherd cheerily. "Never the tail end. That always results in nasty scratches. But now try the head end, ever so gently under the chin and behind the ears and on the top of the head, and see how loudly you can make her purr." gently does it. Always. Ah, listen to that. She's purring like a baby lion. And there was the infant doldrums, sitting happily in the sunny garden, while the bees hummed about the flowers, and the ducklings waddled up the path towards him, with his small face positively beaming, wholly absorbed in experimenting to see whether the yellow cat mechanism produced the loudest purrs if tickled under the chin or behind the ears, or scratched ever so carefully on the very top of the head, and looking, as Mrs. Dismal expressed it, as though he had never seen a little self-pity in all his life. Then the shepherd left the garden and went striding off in the direction of the home of poor Self-Pity, the father. Mrs. Dismal and Gloomy watched him until he was out of sight, and then they looked at one another and said, "He will soon be coming to call us to go with him to the high places. We must go home and get ready." As they spoke, the thorn-shaped seeds in their hearts suddenly throbbed, and a warm, tender sweetness seemed to flood them from head to foot, and mother and daughter kissed each other with a love and gentleness which neither of them had known before, as though already the dreary, self-centered, dismal forebodings, and the haughty, self-willed Gloomy were creatures of the past, and something quite new and very beautiful was appearing instead. As for the shepherd, he strode on down the village street and went on his way towards the lonely farmhouse in which lay Self-Pity, tossing and turning on his sick bed in an agony of fear, and crying out for someone to call the shepherd to come to help him. And that is the end of chapter 7. So, until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his shalom.